Hi everyone, it's John. Welcome back to my channel. It has been, as they say, a minute. Um, Work sort of sunk in its teeth and didn't let go for a while. But I think I'm back for at least a few weeks in order to give you some reviews and show you some of the books that I never really got around to showing anyone. I do have a book review for you today, and it is the book I finished up a bit ago, one you may have heard of, called The Age of American Reason by Susan Jacoby. Um, the little bit there also describes her as the author of The Freethinkers. I think that might be one of her books where she talks about the traditions of American secularism and atheism, and maybe where she talks about Robert Ingersoll too. I think she has a freestanding biography of Robert Ingersoll out actually. But this is her book where she just talks about some particular strains, which I'll obviously go into, that you can find in American culture and thought. Anyone who spent several years in the United States, is born here, raised here, will probably have little trouble in denying the downright, sometimes anti-rationalist, anti-intellectual strains in many of the corners of American culture. My interest in reading Susan Jacoby's book arose from having read Douglas Hofstadter's 1963 classic Anti-Intellectualism in American Life with a couple of friends last year. And I didn't want to take them down a rabbit hole with me, so I left them just having read that. By the way, if you're interested in my review of the Hofstadter book, which is absolutely wonderful, I'll try to, if I can remember, leave a link to it in the drop-down box. Hofstadter's book, which covers much of the same ground that Susan Jacoby's does, is a really, really superb book that has a lot of claims that are actually pretty convincing, and which is enriched by the fact, I think, that Hofstadter himself is a historian. Susan Jacoby is not trained as a historian. He has this sort of deep breadth and width of knowledge to draw from. Also, one of the nice things about Hofstadter's book is that it doesn't really read like a screed. Susan Jacoby's kind of comes off as pettish and like like it's barking at grandchildren, kind of. One of her biggest bête noirs is the increasing time that we spend in front of the television, engaged largely in violent video games, which have encroached on our very human needs for reading and conversation. As true as this might be, in fact, it doesn't take a really insightful cultural critic to point this out. It's simply a that the case is. It doesn't really explain why that is or what it's doing, other than, no one's eating at the dinner table anymore. The argumentative approach of youth culture taking over and pushing away valuable artistic and cultural pursuits leaves her sounding a little bit less like a defender of reason and intellectual pursuit, which is very much what Douglas Hofstadter comes across as sounding like, and kind of leaves her sounding more like, at their worst, the two people I call the Professors Bloom. That would be Alan and Harold. Her laundry list of complaints, sometimes perennial complaints and sometimes new ones, are usually worthy of deeper analysis than she can give them in this book. She mentions, among other things, the infantilization of culture. This is one example I've always been wholeheartedly in agreement with her on. Resurgent religious fundamentalism, the local instead of state or even national control of schools, etc. Unfortunately, some of her criticisms just leave you sort of scratching your head. Jacoby's book opens, like I said, come back to that word again, with a screed against the contemporary American usage of the word folks, especially its increasingly common use when politicians try to sound demotic and familiar. George W. Bush probably did it the most, as you might remember if anyone was old enough to remember him giving public speeches and referring to people as folks. She might be right to have a knee-jerk reaction in thinking this is sort of a populist kind of mollycoddling to an increasingly uninformed public, but it's hard to argue against the idea of politicians trying to look relatable to their constituents. I mean, especially when, not going to mention any names, but some conservative politicians are invested in disowning their own Ivy League educations for the purposes of trying to look like the everyman. Like I said, no names, but you can probably guess who I'm talking about. And it's not just one person, by the way. As a quick aside, from Jacoby's criticism of how Americans are more and more using the word folks, she seems to think that words are passed from generation to generation without ever changing in context or tone or timbre or usage or half a dozen other sociolinguistic characteristics. And I just wanted to add that no one who really thinks seriously about language thinks that language is prescriptive. It's always been, and can only be, I think, descriptive. Dictionaries only describe the mere fact of word usage. They don't prescribe it. It's never a lexicographer's aim to make normative claims about how a language should properly, quote-unquote, be used. End of rant. And what I thought was an especially tone-deaf take, Jacoby kind of romanticizes the decade in which she grew up, the 1950s, as one of the burgeoning American Symphony Orchestra, art museums, Book of the Month clubs, and reading generally, which all may very well have been true in the small town where she grew up in Okemos, Michigan, and many other towns like it. In other words, she remembers it as replete with the kinds of middle-class comforts that we all used to enjoy. But I won't enumerate here the ways in which this highly selective interpretation of the 50s is a product of the author's own personal experience of childhood, which reads, obviously, like it was kind of dripping with privilege in a number of ways. No mention of any of her neighbors not getting to vote. No mention of police dogs being sicked on anyone, but it was a time of symphony orchestras and reading. Well, that's great. Lucky you. The biggest hope that one could possibly have for the book would be for it to approach the insight that Douglas Hofstadter's book had. But it doesn't. Then again, in a way, knowing that, like I said, Jacoby isn't really an academically trained historian. She's just sort of writing popular history here. Having that expectation for her would kind of set things up to be a failure. Nevertheless, whereas Hofstadter plumbs the depths, both historical and contemporary, contemporary for him being the 1950s and 60s, Jacoby mostly aims for the all too easy to notice, low-hanging fruit of today's American anti-intellectualism, the fact that American students are nowhere near the top of other countries in academic performance, the fact that today's politics are little more than telegenic displays of charisma, the fact that the word intellectual itself is associated with pretentious literary eggheads, or technocrats so nefarious that they have to twirl their little handlebar mustaches. In the end, Jacoby makes fair points, but most of them are, like I said, the easiest of points to make. In most places, she makes no attempt to dig into the historical origins of these attitudes, feeling sort of satisfied in describing the superficial manifestations of the problems that have deeply embedded cultural roots that are really rife, I think, for a 21st century explanation. In other words, it's like most books of its kind that come along to anticipate the death of the mind, like Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, written in 1985, or Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, or Dwight MacDonald's much earlier Mass Cult and Mid Cult, all of which I think should be read in close conversational tandem with Jacoby's book. But here we are, at least a few minds in a small corner of BookTube, still very much alive, at the veritable fin de lire, and we cannot help ourselves from reading about the death of reading. The Age of American Unreason by Susan Jacoby. The plan for next week is, if I get motivated enough, to bring you another book review, and then 2 weeks from today to bring you the last installment of my Princeton University books. If I get lazy, what I'll do is I'll just show you the Princeton University books next week, and then hopefully pick up with reviews thereafter. But until then, I will see you hopefully next week.